Good morning, welcome to Insiders. It's now on the record. Australia is going to embrace an emissions trading scheme no matter who wins the next election. But still, the major parties differ on how that scheme will work. And in this election year, it does seem that much of the debate itself is based on politics rather than science, though the Prime Minister has a different interpretation.
The decisions we take on climate change are of a profoundly economic character. It may have been framed as an environmental issue, but it is really overwhelmingly an economic issue. These are crucial economic decisions. If they are done in the wrong fashion, if they're committed to the wrong hands, the consequences for the Australian people will be dire indeed.
Yesterday, the report of the Prime Minister's Task Force on Emissions Trading was released. The report's core failure is its lack of a specific long-term emissions reduction target. For the past 11 years, we've been waiting for the Howard government to set a long-term emissions target for this country. And delegates, we're still waiting.
All this is happening against a background of a government 20 points behind in most opinion polls. And when Labor's primary vote is at a dizzy 52%, precisely where it was 2.5 months ago, coalition supporters are in need of some encouragement. Right now, they'll grasp at any straw, and I've found one. The Irish election held last weekend. Consider this. The Prime Minister, or the Taoiseach as he's known there, Bertie Ahern, is from the centre-right. He'd been in office 10 years, all during a period of sustained economic growth. And yet, like the coalition here, he'd trailed badly in the polls for months. Here's the context. His party polled 42% of the vote to win the last election. But this time around, just 10 days out, he was polling 35%. 3 days out, 37%. And then on polling day itself, 41.6%, a 13-point turnaround in less than 2 weeks. Good enough to allow him to start negotiations aimed at forming a minority government. After the election, the Labor leader said this is the quote, "People have a huge level of indebtedness, large mortgages. They were afraid that a change of government would undermine the economy." And keep in mind, John Howard will be so green by the end of the year he'll be speaking in an Irish accent. And speaking of green politics, our program guest this morning is the Minister for the Environment, Malcolm Turnbull. He'll join us live from the Liberal Party's Federal Council meeting in Sydney. But first, for the latest news headlines overnight, it's Good Morning, Katrina Blowers.
Thanks, Barry. Good morning. US authorities say they've foiled a chilling terror plot to attack New York's John F. Kennedy Airport. 4 people have been charged with conspiring to set off explosives along a 60-kilometre fuel line that feeds into the airport.
The devastation that would be caused had this plot succeeded is just unthinkable.
1 arrest was in New York and 2 in Trinidad. The 4th suspect is still on the run. John Howard is expected to use his key address to the Liberal Party Federal Council to outline his strategy for tackling climate change. The Prime Minister's task force has recommended a national carbon trading scheme, but does not specify a target for cutting emissions. Labor says the government has been in denial on climate change for too long. More than 140 police have been injured in violent clashes with protesters in the German city of Rostock. Riots broke out as tens of thousands of people marched ahead of next week's G8 summit. Protesters hurled Molotov cocktails, stones and bottles at police, who responded with water cannons and tear gas. And Barry, I'll be back with another news update at 11 o'clock.
Katrina, thank you. And we'll go straight to our program guest now, the Minister for the Environment and Water Resources, Malcolm Turnbull, who arrived back in the country only yesterday from the whaling conference in Anchorage, and right now he's gearing up for a day of debate at the Liberal Party's Federal Council meeting in Sydney, and it's from there that he joins me now. Minister, good morning.
Good morning, Barry.
Minister, how do you plan to deal with this criticism that your party is a Johnny-come-lately on climate change?
Well, it's an absurd criticism, Barry. The Australian government has been a world leader in responding to climate change. We set up the first greenhouse office in the world. We've led the world in energy efficiency measures, the phase-out of incandescent or inefficient lighting. We are leading the charge among the developed nations in putting forestry back on top of the climate change agenda with the Global Forestry Initiative. I mean, that's an enormously important initiative. The second largest source of emissions is from deforestation, and that issue has been essentially ignored by Kyoto. Now Australia is taking the lead, working with other countries, developed and developing, to put that back onto the top of the agenda, because it's something like energy efficiency that we can do now, where we can make significant reductions in emissions without new technology. So I reject that charge. Australia is leading. We're going to meet our Kyoto target. Most developed countries won't.
It was only last August that the Prime Minister said one country embracing emissions trading will do great damage to that country. And yet that's precisely what you're about to do. What has changed?
Well, Barry, the key thing with emissions trading is that any emissions reduction strategy is that it's got to take into account the global perspective. And this scheme that has been proposed through the task group is very carefully designed to enable us to do that, to achieve domestic reductions, but do so in a way that doesn't crash our economy. And that's the big difference between us and Labor. You see, Labor are the real climate change deniers. They are denying the global reality of climate change. When Peter Garrett debated me in the House a week or so ago on global warming, he did not mention the global perspective once in a 15-minute speech. Now, the fact is that if we were to follow Labor's agenda and have a target of a 60% cut in emissions, regardless of what the rest of the world does, regardless of the economic analysis, all that we will end up doing is, if the rest of the world does not follow suit, is exporting our emissions-intensive industries and the jobs. And so you lose the jobs, you lose the prosperity, and the emissions go up into the atmosphere from somewhere else. This phenomenon of carbon leakage is a vital one that Labor completely ignores.
We'll get on to that 60% point in a moment, but as it stands, you're not proposing any fully functioning scheme until 2012. That's 4.5 years from now. This timetable does seem to lack a sense of urgency.
Well, with respect, Barry, that's not right. The task group proposes that trading would start in 2011, but there's a lot of preliminary work that needs to be done, setting up a reliable emissions register, national emissions register, a lot of planning to do. You see, this is going to be a multi-billion-dollar exercise. There'll be billions of dollars invested in these carbon credits, so you have to get the measuring and the monitoring right. You've also got to remember this will be the most comprehensive emissions trading scheme ever established anywhere in the world. It will include the sources of 75% of Australia's emissions. That's nearly twice as much as the states are proposing to cover, and it's much more than the Europeans are covering in their, I'm afraid to say, failed emissions trading scheme. Now, other countries, I'm sure, will follow suit, but Australia has benefited from learning from the mistakes of others, and so the scheme we are going to put in place now will be a much better one than if we had set up a scheme 5 years ago or 6 years ago or whatever. So, you know, we have benefited from the errors of others. And I don't say that in a harsh, critical way. Often the first mover makes a lot of mistakes that second movers and third movers can learn from. So that's where we are. We'll have a better scheme. We'll have the world's most comprehensive.
But others would argue that if you'd put a scheme together earlier than this, then there would be less pain.
No, that's completely wrong, Barry. That is so wrong. Because you see, if you impose a very high carbon price now, when the technology is not there to enable you to reduce your emissions. For example, if you impose a high carbon price now, and the alternatives, be they renewables or clean coal, well, clean coal is not yet commercially developed, but if those renewables are more expensive than the carbon price, all you're doing is putting on a large tax to no result. So you see, we've got to remember that while there are some things we can do now, and we are very focused on them, we are world leaders on them, energy efficiency, forestry, in the long term, what we're talking about is an enormous technological transformation to achieve the reductions in emissions that the world needs. And this is not just Australia, this is the whole world needs by the middle of the century. We will have to have almost all of the world's electricity coming from zero or near zero emission sources, and almost all of our transport as well. We simply won't get there without it.
You can achieve that by when?
So we're talking about it. Sorry?
You're saying you can achieve that by when?
I'm not saying we can achieve it. I'm saying you cannot get those reductions unless we do achieve it. Now, I'm confident, because I'm a great optimist, and I believe in technology, that we will be able to do it by the middle of the century. But it is going to cost a lot of money, and there are a lot of technologies that are yet to be fully developed. So the point is that with a carbon price set up through an emissions trading scheme, the critical price signal is not the immediate one, the short-term one, the spot price. It is the long-term one, because people are making plans to build power stations and factories and any energy-intensive industries which will have 25, 30-year, 40-year lifespans. So it's the long-term price, the forward price that matters. And that's why, again, Labor doesn't understand climate change, they don't understand its global nature, and they certainly don't understand anything about economics, which is why they cannot be trusted with such a grave economic challenge.
It may be the long-term price that matters, but wouldn't a short-term signal be of some benefit to business? And at the moment, there's no short-term signal because you're not spelling out a target.
No, well, Barry, we are signalling that a scheme will be set up, the actual targets, and there'll be a series of interim targets. You see, what we'll have is a long-term aspirational target. And of course, we're working very closely with other countries to do that. You would have seen President Bush's announcement a day or so ago. Now, we've been working very closely with the Americans and with other like-minded countries on a strategy that can fast-track the stalled international process and get real reductions. Now, what we will have by next year is a global aspirational target, but then in terms of emission reductions.
But by next year, though, by next year, that's beyond the next election. So you're not spelling out a target between now and the election, but you reserve the right, in fact, you've already done it this morning, to criticise the opposition's target.
Because, Barry, it's completely unthought out. And you see the criticism that we make of the opposition's target is not that 60% cut in emissions by the middle of the century is not a worthy thing to do if the whole world can do it. But if Australia commits itself to that, binds itself to that unilaterally, which is what Labor is proposing, that means that we could be imposing an enormously heavy cost on our industries. You see, if we have a massive carbon price on our energy-intensive industries, and the countries with which we compete do not, all that will happen is that those industries will relocate offshore. The world will still have the same amount of emissions going up into the atmosphere, but there won't be the jobs here. I mean, take Garrett's proposal to have a 20% cut in emissions by 2020.
Which is the same submission that Canada is proposing.
Yeah, well, the Canadians won't get there either. But what Garrett is proposing would mean that would be the equivalent of replacing all of our coal-fired power stations with nuclear power stations or with some other form of zero-emission technology, and taking all our cars off the road. So now that is completely unfeasible. Everyone knows that.
Is that going to happen in Canada, Minister? And how responsible are they to propose something similar?
No, well, I've discussed this very directly and in detail with the Canadian Environment Minister. They will not reach a target of that kind. What they are seeking to achieve, however, is big savings in terms of insulation and heating. You see, Canada, because it's so cold, does have more available to it a lot of energy efficiency measures that a country like Australia doesn't, because plainly if you can re-insulate a lot of buildings so as to reduce your heating bill, you've got some low-hanging fruit there. But every country is different, Barry, and the point I'm making really is that Labor has not thought any of this through. Now, we are going through this methodically, carefully. We're sending the signals to business. Businesses welcome the task group report. It knows that there is going to be a price on carbon, and they will start to plan and calculate a forward price. But we have to be very careful that we do not get into some sort of self-destructive orgy of moralising, which is what Labor is talking about. They're talking about setting targets which will make them feel good, but will devastate the economy if other nations do not follow suit. You see, the thing that you've got to remember is that global warming is a global problem. Labor just does not get it. They are in denial. They talk about doing things in Australia, which is fine, but if we do things in Australia which are not matched by other countries, will make no impact on global climate, and we will devastate our own economy to no gain. We'll export the jobs and we'll export the emissions. And that's what Labor's about. They have not thought this through.
But I just wonder how credible it is, though, to portray Labor's policies, you say, as irresponsible and damaging. You don't put out a figure of your own, and yet you portray your policy as relatively painless.
No, I don't think we've said it's painless at all. In fact, if you read the report, it says it's going to impose a very high cost. I mean, Barry, even if the whole world, suddenly there was a snap of the fingers and the whole world decided to impose measures that would get us all on a track to a big reduction in emissions by mid-century, 50%, 40%, 60%, whatever, name your figure. Let's say we moved into a perfect theoretical world. It will still have a big cost for Australia because we are an energy-intensive country. We have industries that depend on cheap energy. I mean, there are a lot of jobs in Australia that are only here because of relatively cheap coal-fired energy. Now, as you put a higher price on that energy, you impact our economy. That's why it has to be done very carefully. And the question for the Australian people is, are you going to trust a bunch of fanatics, which is really where Garrett and Rudd are at the moment? They are on a fanatical moralising campaign, blind to the economics, blind to the realities, determined to prove that they are greener than the greenest green. And if you have policies based on that type of ideology, you may feel pure, but you will be pure at the price of being very poor. And what we are seeking to do is to achieve real results. That's why we're working internationally. President Bush's initiative, the Global Forestry Initiative, AP6, these are all measures and changes that Australia is working with and contributing to.
Minister,
so we are playing an effective role internationally.
Minister, would you regard Arnold Schwarzenegger as a fanatic? He's proposing 80% by 2050 in California, a Republican governor.
Well, look, I have great admiration for Governor Schwarzenegger, but he has no idea how he will get there. That is climate change Hollywood style. That is saying we're going to have, these targets are set way into the future, long after Governor Schwarzenegger, like all of us, I fear, will be contributing to the carbon cycle ourselves directly. Now, the reality is that that is in effect, as it is for any state, something of a gesture, because because Barry, California can draw a line around its boundaries and say, we have so much emissions, but they buy a lot of their electricity from interstate. So they buy electricity from another state which is emitting CO2 from the power station, but they don't count that CO2 in their own emissions. You see, this is the point about global warming. Consider this: natural gas, a vital part of the global mix, because it results, you can produce electricity with lower emissions. So natural gas is good. Every time we export natural gas from Australia, we increase our emissions, but if that gas is used to replace a coal-fired power station in China, it reduces China's emissions. And so again, one of the absurdities of Labor's policy is that it doesn't take into account the global nature of the problem. So yes, we have to act, but we have to act in a way that respects our economy, that doesn't unduly or unfairly damage our economy, and above all, engages in international action.
Okay,
and that
Minister,
is not on their agenda.
This debate is creating some strange bedfellows, Peter Garrett and Arnold Schwarzenegger, but we'll move on. I want to raise a couple of quick issues with you. Tomorrow, you and the Prime Minister will be meeting again with Steve Bracks on the $10 billion water plan. Is this a make or break meeting?
Well, I wouldn't put it as high as that. We are working very carefully with all of the states on the detail. I had a very detailed meeting with John Thwaites, the Victorian Water Minister, and Carleen Maywald, our South Australian counterpart in Adelaide 10 days ago. We're just working through the detail, Barry, identifying the differences, resolving them where we can, so that we want to get it narrowed down to just a few big issues. Now, whether we can knock those over tomorrow, I don't know, but really the best way to deal with this, and this is the way the other three states are dealing with it, and certainly the way I'm dealing with it, is to take a constructive approach. We had a meeting with the premiers, as you know, back in February. We agreed on some principles. We agreed to draft some legislation, which we've done, send it out for comment. We've had a lot of comments back. We've redrafted it, improved it, made changes, amendments here and there. This is a collaborative exercise. This is a vital issue for Australia. The Murray-Darling Basin needs a change in its governance. We cannot continue as we have done, but we have to work constructively to ensure we get to the right end. So we are very open-minded and very keen to negotiate. But you're not getting inflammatory rhetoric from me, or indeed from the other states in the press. We're interested in outcomes and results, and that just comes from being very businesslike. It's a long document. You just start it, you just go through it, knock off the barnacles one by one, and then when there's a few big ones left, then you've got to see if you can make a decision, one way or the other.
And we're running out of time, but on the whaling issue, not a lot of success, obviously, in anchorage, not in the short term anyway.
Well, I don't think that's quite true, Barry. I mean, you've got to remember last year in St Kitts, the Japanese won a vote, albeit just by a bare majority, to resume commercial whaling. This year, the Japanese lost every vote. We were, it was said in the media that Australia wasn't focused on whaling. Well, that we proved the critics wrong. We had the numbers on the floor in a massive way. We engaged with the Japanese honestly, constructively, candidly. Now, they haven't taken humpbacks off their scientific whaling
and that's what I had in mind yet. When I said not a lot of progress.
Well, we'll see. I think it was a very, very bad. It was a very bad conference for Japan. I think their huge dummy spit at the end will not reflect well in Tokyo. And I think the Japanese government really has to sit back and ask itself, looking at the debacle that was Japan's outcome at the whaling conference, and really say to themselves, can we continue to fly in the face of world opinion on this issue?
And can you use the APEC meeting to increase the pressure on the Japanese Prime Minister?
Well, we raise this at every level with Japan. We raise it at the Whaling Commission level, at a ministerial level, and the Prime Minister's raised it with the Japanese Prime Ministers over the years. The thing we've got to be very careful about, and this is the subtlety, is that whaling is essentially a nationalistic issue in Japan. That's its support base. So the engagement with Japan has to be as a friend, it has to be candid, it has to be constructive. If you threaten Japan, or if you go to the absurdity that Garrett and Rudd did of saying that they would send the Navy in, which of course would be unlawful, to attack or board Japanese ships in international waters off Antarctica, which is what they were proposing.
I don't think that's precisely what they were proposing.
No, Barry, let me tell you. I have read their policy statement, and it says that they believe they want Australian naval ships to intercept and board Japanese whalers in the waters off Antarctica. Now, they are international waters protected by the Antarctic Treaty. So they got their international law wrong. It's just another example of them going off half-cocked. But the fact is, the more threatening you are to Japan, the more they dig their heels in. So engaging with Japan is something that has to be done constructively and in a non-aggressive way.
Well, hang on, accusing them of a dummy spit is not a constructive way to go, then, is it?
Well, it's not. It's not accusing them of a dummy spit. I think with the best will in the world, their own mothers would recognise they'd done a dummy spit. It was, to stand up at the end of the conference and say, "That's it. We're threatening to pull out." I mean, that is a dummy spit. It's on any view.
Okay, look, more speculation in the media this morning of the merits of Peter Costello assuming the leadership of the Liberal Party. What do you say to that kind of speculation?
John Howard has the complete confidence of the Liberal Party. He is the leader of the Liberal Party. He has got a proven track record of achievement as Prime Minister. The Australian people know that the prosperity, the security they've enjoyed for 11 years is in large measure due to the leadership and the wisdom of John Howard, and that's why he is the right man to lead us into this election, just as he was in the elections before.
So there's still a measure of self-belief within the party?
The party is very committed to the values that we embody. We are the party that has delivered the security, the prosperity, the good economic management that Australia's enjoyed over the last 11 years, and we'll be asking the Australian people at the end of this year to entrust us with a further 3 years rather than risk that prosperity with a Labor Party whose economics, as in climate change, as we've just been discussing, is based on ideology, not on sound economic management. This is a very dangerous option. Kevin Rudd is not thinking his policies through. He's under the control on the industrial side, under the control of union bosses on the one hand, and on the climate change side, he is locking himself in to a series of policies that will devastate vital Australian industries and to no effect. That's the tragedy of it.
Okay.
Because what his climate change policy will not just export jobs, it will export the emissions and achieve nothing globally. The climate change denier, Barry, is Kevin Rudd, aided and abetted by Peter Garrett. They don't understand this issue. They don't understand its complexity any more than they understand whaling.
We're back where we started, but we are out of time. Thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you, Barry. Thanks.
Climate change is something that I don't think many people understand.
We've certainly seen a swing with the way the weather patterns have been going, and it affects all of us here.
There's an election coming up very shortly, and it's an issue that Howard has been forced to look at, but normally he wouldn't pay any attention to it at all.
They've thought long and hard about it. I would think that it's now time to address it. They've done that.
Have they thought long and hard? I think they've been swept it under the rug for years and years, and they've tried to avoid talking about it.
Very nice.
It's an international decision. We're a very small fish in a big pond when it comes to this sort of thing.
Why do we always have to wait for overseas?
A national emissions trading scheme is essential to have in place. How it will be policed is another thing. If business doesn't get an immediate benefit, they will find ways to avoid the policy.
I'm not sure how this emission scheme is going to work. I don't think anyone really is. Carbon trading, carbon credits. I mean, do we all have to go out there and plant 100 trees to get rid of our emissions from our car?
I don't really think John Howard's got enough time to make up ground on this issue for the upcoming election, because I think people are pretty wise these days, and I think they're all seeing it as a grab for votes. Yes, the opposition probably brought it to the fore. Johnny's had to do something fairly quickly. Call me cynical, but I mean, he could have done this easily over 2 years ago.
Sure, yeah.
Why didn't he do something about it then?
Labor would introduce a climate change policy which would be much stronger than a Howard government.
You've got the likes of Peter Garrett and others within the party. They're really passionate about it and have been for a long, long time. Someone needs to have a real close think about it, because it can mean something to all of us. It can make everything more expensive. We don't want our economy to suffer because of it. There's not much point being buoyant if we haven't got a will to live in.
The way the political parties treat this is something that would affect the way I vote, because I'm interested in, not just for myself, but I'm interested in for my children, grandchildren and future generations, and it needs to be serious, and it needs to be done now.
And call me cynical, one of them said, call me cynical, but this could have been done some time ago.
Precisely. I think that's the message from our golfing commentators, and that's pretty much the way the community views the government's policy on climate change, with good reason. Listening to Malcolm Turnbull just then, I mean, it was like 1984. It was a doublespeak. There he was saying that the government are world leaders on climate change. Everyone knows they've done virtually nothing for a decade. He was saying the government are the great internationalists. We all know they've been isolationist on this issue for a decade. I mean, people aren't that silly.
But the confusion there too is whether Australia is going it alone, and the Prime Minister did say last August, going it alone, you'll damage your economy, or are we going global?
I thought we were going alone. We certainly weren't going alone last year.
That's not what Malcolm Turnbull was saying.
No,
he sees it as a sort of a global effort.
I think John Howard might want to have a chat to Malcolm Turnbull about the mixed messages that Malcolm was putting out in that interview. The Prime Minister has made the point over the last couple of days that Australia has to get started on this topic, and he has tried to tell us that he's changed his position since late last year. I think one of the fundamental problems the government has is that there's no cut-through moment of contrition for John Howard. We're sort of getting there by incremental steps. We now acknowledge that climate change is a problem. We're going to have to set a long-term target, although we probably won't find that out until after the election, what that target is. We're going to have an emissions trading system. Now, we're not waiting for the rest of the world on that. We're going to have one. This is what John Howard made clear over the last couple of days.
And Andrew, the risk is that they'll be caught between two stools.
Look, there is exactly that risk. I think they mismanaged the whole climate change issue by not trying to lance that boil before. Now they're trying to acknowledge a problem they, in their hearts, think is exaggerated, and the public sees straight through it. Here we have a problem that the government is backtracking not just in climate change but also on IR reform, and it doesn't look credible. It doesn't look like it's in their hearts. And I think this is one of the reasons for the Liberals to contemplate a change of leadership if the polls don't improve in the next month. Because that will give them the excuse to do a genuine backtrack.
Well, a lot to discuss, but before we go on, we'll get some background and analysis now from Paul Kelly, political commentator with Australia. And Paul, good morning. The Shergold report, take us through the key findings, and I think we can assume from the start that the government will embrace the key points.
I think what we've got here, Barry, for the first time in Australia, we've got a framework for a national emissions trading regime. based on a carbon price, based on a long-term target which will be decided next year after further study. This represents a huge policy reversal by the Howard government, just huge, after 11 years. And the foundational idea of the report is that Australia must press ahead in its own right. It can't wait for the rest of the world, and by pressing ahead it can try and influence better what the rest of the world does down the track. I think there are a couple of features of this report which do deserve to be highlighted. One is that it's based very much on the idea of a market adjustment. That is, the market through the price mechanism determines how emissions will be reduced down the track. The politicians don't do that. So the report opposes very much the idea of politicians saying, well, the answer's solar or the answer's nuclear. Now, I think that's an important position, and I think to a large extent that's not understood in the country, it's not understood by the public, and it will be quite contentious. The other point to make about the report is that it wants to hasten slowly. It wants a low price for carbon at the start. It wants a very moderate adjustment at the start. It wants the major cuts made down the track. It opposes very much the idea of early and deep cuts. Now, this is going to be a very contentious part of the report.
So the Prime Minister delivers a major speech at the conference in the next hour or so. What are you expecting?
Well, I think what John Howard will do in this speech to the Liberal Party Federal Council, Barry, is that he will put the Prime Ministerial imprimatur on this report. This report will become the Howard model. He'll embrace, I think, the main elements of the report: emissions trading, a price for carbon, a long-term target, price rises across the board to get the price mechanism working. But above all, what John Howard will try and do is, I think he'll try and redefine this issue as an economic issue. And he'll say there are all sorts of problems and challenges for the country and there's all sorts of risks. And therefore, what you've got to do is you've got to understand this is an economic issue, and the party you want to look after this is the party that can best manage the economy, that is the government.
Well, the panel has already identified a couple of vulnerabilities with this whole thing. Do you see any?
Well, there certainly are vulnerabilities, Barry. I mean, I think the first point to make is that John Howard has now got a position here for the first time. He hasn't had a position in the past. So the interesting thing will be to see what he does with this position. I think, frankly, there's a lot he can do with it. But there are two really big vulnerabilities. The first one is that he doesn't have a target. And I think it's going to be incredibly hard for the government to attack Kevin Rudd's 60% target, because what Rudd will say is he'll say, well, Prime Minister, what's your target? You don't have one? You're not serious? Well, I've got a target. My target's 60%, and I am serious. Now, I think that is an incredibly powerful position for Kevin Rudd against John Howard, and I don't really see how the government gets around that. I think the other political problem for the government is exactly the reversal. That is, John Howard has been attacked for a long time for being a sceptic on climate change. Now he's proposing to do something about it, and that means that prices will be rising for electricity, for energy, for petrol. And there's a problem here for the Prime Minister. He may well be attacked on precise this ground. There may well be concerns and problems about this position. After all, this is a Howard model. And the great irony, given the strange behaviour of the electorate at the moment in terms of the way it sees Kevin Rudd and John Howard, it may well applaud Kevin Rudd for doing something about climate change and penalise John Howard for the price effects.
And the other big political story of the week, I guess, was kicked off when Kevin Rudd called a news conference and said this.
I've earlier this morning directed the National Secretary of the Australian Labor Party to obtain from Mr Mighell his resignation from the Labor Party. That resignation was received by us a short time ago.
So they booted out Dean Mighell. How do you think that played out?
All very serious. Well, it was a very quick and surgical response by Kevin Rudd. I think it was a correct response. I think this sort of firmness helps him with the public. He looks strong. What it does, of course, is that it highlights this ongoing relationship between the party and the union movement, which the Howard government wants to keep up front. The Howard government wants to exploit this. To what extent the government can actually get traction on this remains to be seen. The big issue here, of course, is what Kevin Rudd eventually decides to do with his IR policy. We're seeing ongoing changes each week virtually. We saw Julia Gillard this week make a very major concession to the building and construction industry. which I think was very sensible. Further on down the track, we'll see something more from Kevin Rudd, but I think he feels pretty confident about IR, and I would imagine that any concessions will be reasonably minor.
Paul Kelly, thank you. And we'll get on to the Dean Mighell matter shortly, but further on climate change and this question of the target, Paul Kelly says that that's a weakness in the government's policy, though I guess what it does is exposes Kevin Rudd as a target, whereas the government is a moving target because they can't be pinned down on detail.
Well, I think this debate about targets and the emissions trading system is unfortunately shaping up as one that's, if you'll excuse the pun, largely about hot air, in that the rubber hits the road with an emissions trading system when you get a target for 2020 or 2030, where you can calculate the economic costs and people can tell what it's going to cost them. And as we stand, neither side of politics is going to give us that ahead of the election, that short-term target. The government is trying to confect this spurious debate about how Kevin Rudd's a fundamentalist and he's going to wreck the economy because he has this 2050 target. That's really an aspirational target. It's trying to quantify where we need to go to have a climatic effect, and it's based around the international consensus that we need to try and stop global warming at about 2 degrees Celsius. And it's broadly in line with what other countries are doing. And I really don't think the government's going to get there trying to attack Kevin Rudd for that when they don't have any targets, short or long term, of their own.
Depends how you frame it a bit, though, isn't it? I mean, I noticed all the shock horror headlines in the last day or two from the Prime Minister's Task Force report, which said, good heavens, our power bills and our petrol will go up.
What, you have a tax and it's a tax?
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, like, we didn't know this had cost. And if it comes down to, like Tim Flannery, Australian of the Year, was saying, well, we need to increase energy prices by 30%. That's sort of Labor policy, I presume. That's the effect of it. Let's have a debate. Do you want your petrol at $1.80? Or do you want to have $1.50?
I mean,
let's
Andrew, but
be
you can't
practical.
say that that's Labor policy because we don't have
We
a
don't
short
know
or
what it is.
medium term either side of politics.
No,
We have consensus, actually, that we'll find these things out next
after
year.
we vote.
The reason we don't have a target, because everyone knows, if once people know what the target is and how is needed to achieve it, they'll flinch in horror.
But will they? Because the Climate Institute says that this $200 a year increase on power prices is based on a 2030 figure or something. And then, in fact, in reality, it's a 0.5%.
Who's the Climate Institute?
Interesting thing about
power
bills.
Who are they? They come from nowhere because they've got this agenda, and because they say something that the press likes. Suddenly, none of us know who they are.
Well, we do
I've got a much simpler question here.
2020, the Prime Minister's own task force said if you're going to achieve that, this cut by 20% by 2020, as Garrett has said in the past, you're going to have to do the equivalent of converting every power station to nuclear and take every car off the road. That's why they don't have a medium target, Lenore. No other reason.
I don't think you'll hear that from Peter Garrett either.
Not now.
There's
Not now.
an interesting point to make here, and it's a very, very simple political point. If power bills are going to go up, what, a couple of dollars a week, what happens then? The government gives pensioners $2 a week like it did at the 2004 election, ostensibly to pay their power bills. It's going to have surpluses through to about 2023.
No, but George, that's not the point.
There are plenty of ways for a government of the day to deal with the cost impact
You're
on the
avoiding
punters.
the exact argument for why the power bills must rise. It is not just to do something.
No, it's
it
to
is
trigger a market
stop
response to
people from
reduce
using
emissions.
power.
Yes.
Why would you compensate people for a price rise in power that will leave them to consume exactly what they've been consuming before? This is not.
No, I mean,
No, what he's suggesting
cost.
you'll compensate part of the population.
You can do whatever you can do whatever you want.
It's
to
an
get there.
insane debate.
This is the point. This is called politics.
But of course,
That's how you get there.
if you sign the Kyoto Protocol, you can also bring down emissions by making investments in other countries where there's low-hanging fruit and avoid immediate problems like that at home.
As we just saw, there's a UN report in this kind of exact what you just said in Europe, where they're trying to do that. The high-emitting countries are trying to buy projects in foreign countries, carbon credits to offset. And you know what's happening? It's rorted because no one knows how to measure it, no one knows how to police it. This is the greatest rort that we're inflicting on ourselves.
Actually, that's not true. The CDM scheme is now working really well under the Kyoto Protocol.
Really?
And if you look at the figures on the website, you can see that there is an enormous reduction in carbon emissions in India and China as a result of it.
Now, is it just me, or I thought that John Howard had gone reasonably soft on Nicola Stern and the Stern report up until this week, and then the rhetoric changed in the lead up to his own report being released. This is what he had to say.
It would not be a grab bag of proposals taken holus bolus from a report written by an Englishman for European conditions and designed to promote the political objectives of the British government, Mr Speaker, because that is what the Stern report is all about. Stern is not the biblical scholar of climate change that is posited by those who sit opposite.
Now, he said that to give credibility to his own report, so that it's an Australian report for Australia.
Peter Shergold is a biblical scholar. I think that's what he was trying to say.
But I think this thing here, I know it's a bit late for I told you so's and all that, but this illustrates, that very clip illustrates where John Howard has been culpable in not treating the issue properly. Australia should have had our own examination and proper inquiry with experts around the world, carefully chosen, to do an economic analysis way before Stern. And so when Stern finally comes, the press sees on him, and Howard's got no feather to fly with until now.
Well, astonishingly, Andrew, I agree with you, and it should have looked at the costs as well as the costs of action as well as the costs of inaction on climate change.
But then, you know what would have happened, Lenore, if it was properly done? Just like the British House of Lords inquiry, which came out before the thing, and they would have said,
here, Andrew.
No, but you want the report, but you want the inquiry,
well,
but you don't want the result.
I've read the British
The House of Lords inquiry said overall,
report.
yeah, because you don't like it.
No, because it's not credibly argued.
Overall, the costs of doing something about climate change are probably not worth it.
Now, I want to go back to where we started. First of all, before we spoke with Paul Kelly, Andrew, you suggested that maybe they ought to be looking at Peter Costello as the leader between now and the next election. You got the sense that Kevin Rudd was building in a bit of insurance yesterday, just in case, just in the unlikely event that happens, when he had this to say yesterday.
If you're putting yourself forward as the alternative Prime Minister of the country and the alternative leader of the Liberal Party, why has the Treasurer been silent on this great economic and environmental challenge of our age all these years, and he himself in charge of the agency most capable of delivering a framework for dealing with it? As we know, Mr Costello ignored the advice of the Secretary of his department, hoping that the leadership of his party would not be obtained by showing actual leadership, but simply he would obtain it as some form of entitlement.
Well, as a matter of fact, Peter Costello was the co-signatory to a cabinet submission in 2003 along with David Kemp, which proposed doing exactly what we're doing now, as in carefully looking at emissions trading back then, and it was knocked off by the Prime Minister.
You know why I think that's potent? It's not just because Costello might be seen to have been on top of a political strategy to deal with it before the Prime Minister, which is a judgment thing. But a lot of this climate change thing is in fact powerful as it's a religious thing. It's how you feel as just as much as what you do.
It's a scientific thing, actually.
No,
Andrew.
look, that's your view, and I'll stick to mine.
And
thank you.
most of the rest of the
and
world.
Secondly, well, there's a lot of hysteria about, and I'll discuss that in a second.
But because of that, why is
the
it
other thing
potent?
is an issue. No, it's a religious thing, and then so Costello can say, I was onto this before. My heart is pure. I've got a track record. And the other thing is a generational thing, and I think that, in fact, politically is the most potent thing about climate change. It's new, it's fresh, as opposed to old. Well, how does that symbolise Howard and Rudd? Very potently.
And a point to be made here, though, and we're still talking 6 months into the Rudd leadership on Labor topics. John Howard is still struggling to come up with an agenda of his own that doesn't seem to respond to something he overlooked last year.
Right.
Now, just track back quickly when he was bagging Nicola Stern. He just said the other day at the Liberal Federal Council that they've been working on this for 6 months. Well, blow me down, but 6 months ago, thereabouts, Rudd became leader and Stern had just released his report. This thing is reactive, and that's really where the Prime Minister struggles to get a cut-through message to the electorate.
And he also came under a bit of pressure in the Parliament during the week over this promotional campaign, advertising campaign that's coming up on climate change. And we'll have a look at part of that debate now, and then we'll get your assessment of the performances of the two leaders.
What is the change that has caused our Prime Minister to have his Damascus Road experience on the question of climate change? Could it possibly be something to do with opinion polls? And what are we going to do about it? How do we convince the Australian people that I, John Winston Howard, am suddenly convinced about a proposition I've spent the previous 11 years denying?
I say to the Leader of the Opposition, don't come into this place with your confected moral outrage and start lecturing we who sit on this side of the House about standards of propriety. The Leader of the Opposition has the most fragile glass jaw in Australian politics. Now, the Leader of the Opposition has come into this place feeling very, very much the cock of the walk. He feels full of himself. He feels very much on top of everything. But let me just remind to the Leader of the Opposition that there is a long way to go before a decision is made by your master and mine, and that is the Australian people.
What did you see in the two performances there? Anything?
I saw John Howard almost losing his temper, and I haven't seen that in 11 years. Maybe there was that moment in the reconciliation speech in '97 where the Indigenous delegates sat up and turned their back on him. That was the angriest I've seen John Howard in a long, long time. But also slightly unhinged. The tone for a Prime Minister shouldn't be, come on, mate, we'll fix you come election day, which is really what he was saying.
And it was also yesterday too when he went before the party and started talking about change, and he suddenly on the television news as you're getting these grabs about the Prime Minister saying, well, you know, Kevin Rudd talks about a time for change. It's not a time for change. That is hardly the way to tackle it, isn't it?
The other thing is that Kevin Rudd Kevin Rudd does have a reputation for being a little bit arrogant, but he has kept it pretty well under wraps. He's kept it in train for the duration of his leadership so far, and he wasn't really looking arrogant. He wasn't looking like he thought he was the cock of the walk or whatever the Prime Minister's phrase was. He has possibly a right to, given where the opinion polls are, but he is actually reining in any sort of potential for hubris. And I think
that's right. And you know, the other thing was the glass jaw comment. And I think, you know, to some extent it's true that Kevin Rudd has had a glass jaw, but I think it's one of those attacks that the more he's attacked, the more he grows stronger. It's like a cartoon character is absorbing the energy of the attacks. The glass jaw thing, I think his ability to handle the criticism quite well, starting from the Brian Burke thing, keeping his cool, has answered that question about whether he's a glass jaw. He's looked stronger. And every attack seems to have the same sort of pattern. It's like with the Theresa Rain affair, where he's under attack about how she deals with it. It turns into how much he loves his wife and how much of a modern husband he is. You may think that's spin. I think it's spin. But it works. And every attack that the government has made has been so constructed it's actually left Kevin Rudd looking tough,
on the issue of advertising,
decisive and loving.
Yeah. On the issue of advertising, though, I think people are quite rightly getting very cynical. I mean, the government, by the time of the election, over its period in office, will have spent upwards towards $2 billion on political advertising. Now, some of that's quite legitimate information campaigns, but a lot of it runs pretty close to the edge. And now we're seeing this extraordinary phenomenon where it appears that they go to the ad agencies before they actually announce the policy or put the legislation into the parliament.
They'd actually block book time, which if the television networks were ever honest about it, they'd be able to tell you that we already know the government's got these ads planned between now and election day. Yeah. Labor have got a whistleblower on the climate change ads, which is why I found it strange that John Howard spent a week pretending. He had this quite bizarre construct until I'd ticked it off. It actually wasn't real.
Which just looks shifty.
Well, I think Michelle Grattan wrote that he was looking slightly crazy, which was a big call for Michelle.
I don't think he'll ever be crazy. I think we had this debate, we had variations of this debate in the past about how much this looks like 1995, and Andrew's point about Kevin Rudd looking stronger. Actually, what was going through my head was an image of Keating throwing punches at Howard in '95, and every time he missed, John Howard said, "I'm still here." Yep. People felt sorry for John.
See, in Rudd's case, it answers a specific doubt, I think, that was there. Is he tough enough? Is the nerd? And he's looking, he is tough enough. And when people complain, oh, he drives his staff too hard and is very arrogant, I think that actually keeps answering it. It makes him look good.
We need to move on now to the Dean Mighell matter. And what was he sacked for in the end? Was he sacked for foul language, or was he sacked for, conning the employers?
I think Kevin Rudd sacked him so he could show that he's not a creature of the trade union movement.
That's precisely it. Here's yet another attack, and the latest, that leaves Kevin Rudd looking stronger. Kevin Rudd does have a problem with the perception that he is the creature of unions, and the union influence in the Labor Party is obviously too strong. His policy is too bad. And Dean Mighell is perfect. Dean Mighell has laid down his life for the sake of making Kevin Rudd look tough, decisive and anti-union bastardry.
At least temporarily.
But only in image.
Well, Dean Mighell couldn't resist one dig, though, on the way out the door. Here he is on the John Fane program.
Yeah, it's a bit ironic, Yeah, Kevin Rudd gets in trouble because his wife underpays people, and I get in trouble because I get workers' wage increase. It was a bit of a hard one to cop, that one. But anyway, it's been an interesting week in politics.
Bit of a hard one to argue against, really, isn't it?
Yeah, isn't it? Wayne Swan attempted to make light of the whole thing, but then Wilson Tuckey had a reasonable line back at him.
Everyone has their black sheep. The Liberal Party's got theirs. You see some of them out here every day with Wilson Tuckey. You see Senator Heffernan.
The reality of Swan is, could crawl under a rug and not make a bump.
I'm not quite sure what he means by that, but I think
but
he's
it's
saying...
interesting.
I don't think he likes him.
It still leaves Labor with the huge political problem, I think, although the public doesn't seem to. I think that why is it that Dean Mighell and the CFMEU hard men in Perth, for example, are gloating about the possible rise of a Rudd government and what they stand to gain? That's the central issue. Still, militant unions, exactly like Dean Mighell, think that a Rudd government means they can run wild in the workplace. And that hasn't been addressed by specific legislation proposals by Labor. Only Kevin Rudd say so.
Lenore Taylor, George Megalogenis and Andrew Bolt will be back shortly, but it's time now for Mike Bowers and his regular segment, Talking Pictures.
I'm Michael Bowers and I'm pictorial editor with the Sydney Morning Herald. I'm talking pictures this morning with David Pope, who cartoons for Sydney's Sun Herald newspaper, but he cartoons under the name Heinrich Hinz. Welcome to the program.
G'day, Mike.
What's with that? What's your pen name?
Oh, look, it was a name I adopted before I thought of cartooning as a career, and the signature's just stuck since then.
Well, carbon emissions was on the agenda this week and things were definitely heating up for the Prime Minister. In question time, he got so animated that the finger got into control point where it was actually blurred on the photograph.
He did seem to lose it a bit this week. I mean, Andrew's shutter speed can't even quite keep up with the speed of the finger.
I do love this Kudelka cartoon.
There's something very dinosaurial about
dinosaurial
about the government's position on climate change at the moment. But I think perhaps a bit premature going into the museum. There's still 5 months to go.
Yes.
Still time to evolve some opposable thumbs.
Well, there were shocking revelations about Electrical Trade Union Secretary Dean Mighell this week that led to Kevin Rudd disconnecting him from the ALP completely. God, you would hate to have all your private conversations taped, wouldn't you?
Well, that's right. Although, Warren's got this lovely cartoon of Rudd taking out the batteries. I kind of think Rudd's probably quietly a little bit happy about this. He's a chance to stand up, and so it's a lovely little pantomime that they can act out here on this.
Yes, David Rose actually picked up on this with a little neighbourly solidarity, and John Howard's leaning over the fence here, and Kevin's just hung out the washing, which is Dean Mighell in these incredibly gross undies. He draws undies like no other cartoonist, David.
No, well, I don't think any of us try to match it, really. It's interesting, though, you then have to just check out in the background there the Hills hoist that's in the Coalition's yard. And,
with IR and Iraq.
Just a nice little touch there. There's some stuff to look at over the fence.
David, it seems like a lot of cartoonists picked up on the tension between the Rudds and conflict of interest and actually drew them in the bed. What's with that?
Well, I mean, there's a journalistic convention that we don't pry too deeply into the private lives of politicians. There should be some privacy, and that's what cartoons are for. You get them in and we completely shamelessly make up the stories that are behind closed doors. So I think we were all speculating about how, what conversations might have been going on in the Rudd household last weekend.
Nico has drawn this very disturbing cartoon of the couple in bed. These common law contracts of yours, you're a real little capitalist vampire. I love it when you talk dirty.
Well, look, the great thing about this cartoon is it reminds you about what the issue was to start with, which was the common law contracts and how they were used to date a whole lot of workers, and that sort of disappeared through the whole campaign. And suddenly it's become the whole issue became a sort of work-life balance thing.
News poll sort of indicates that it doesn't matter what Kevin does, it just seems to come up smelling roses every time. John Spooner's picked up on it with the Prime Minister sort of sitting outside looking for employment, with Therese looking out going, new work directions, we might be able to help you.
Yeah, what sort of position do you think she might be able to find him? I mean, that's what that cartoon led you to speculate. I know there's some jobs going in ABC Weather, aren't there?
Well, controversy with this week with a cartoonist, Bill Leake from The Australian, and his depiction of Kevin Rudd as Tintin. It's drawn comment from the copyright holders in Belgium that they're infringing the copyright, and they've asked him to cease and desist.
Well, look, cartoonists have always pinched bits of popular culture to put in our cartoons as a way of making comment on politics and society. So I'm really surprised that they would be so humorless as to try and take him to task.
David, it's been a great pleasure talking this morning. Thanks very much for taking the time.
No, it's been my pleasure too. Thanks.
And during the week, Julia Gillard was the guest at the National Press Club, and she was asked again a question on her personal life and whether she would consider marrying her boyfriend if Labor won the election.
Do you think that if you did become Deputy Prime Minister, the forces of respectability would make you change your mind about Tim Matheson?
Lincoln, your unhealthy obsession about this matter disturbs me. And I'll make decisions about the future of my personal life for things that are about me, Julia Gillard the person, not Julia Gillard the politician. And so those things are in my personal domain.
Things will always be thus. Women will be asked different questions to men.
Well, I was glad of the applause. I thought that probably says where most of us are with that kind of questioning.
But the questions keep coming. I mean, Julia needs to be commended for her forbearance. You'd lose your patience after a while, surely.
Now, in the Parliament, Peter Costello in particular, but the Coalition have been complaining about this tactic of the Labor Party. Whenever they're about to make the earth-shattering point, somebody steps up and gets in the way of the camera and blocks the shot. And we saw another case of it this week.
I welcome the fact that the whip's trying to block the camera up. Mr. Speaker, could the side screen move to the right, please? I had one side screen for me offie and one for my leg break, Mr. Speaker.
I played a bit of social cricket with Dick Adams. He's a wicket-keeper, and I can tell you nothing ever got past him.
That's true.
Now, Ian Macfarlane, the Energy Minister, spoke to the world, to the APEC ministers at a meeting in Darwin, and had this to say.
We must also develop outcomes that will unleash the trillions of dollars of energy investment that are required, whether they be dollars, pestos or rubles, or whichever country you use in your member economy.
George, how many pestos to the Australian dollar, just quickly?
A jar of them, I think. I'm not sure.
How many pestos in an Arabiata, George?
2 crackers and a bowl of spaghetti.
OK, just before final observations on that issue that we raised earlier, is it a live issue? Do you think that the Liberal Party, is there any prospect the Liberal Party will change leaders between now and the next election?
I think the backbenchers who are contemplating losing their jobs in a couple of months are wondering whether they made the right decision last year. But that's a different thing from actually contemplating changing leaders now. It's a live issue in terms of chatter. It's not a live issue in terms of anything going to happen in the next little while, I don't think.
Barry, the window, if there is a window, it's the end of next month. At the end of this month, going into July, over the winter. We ran those numbers a few weeks back about the budget bounce. We expect to see some sort of bounce by the end of June. If there isn't much of a bounce to speak of, others may want to talk about it
into July,
again.
Perhaps, they won't get the impact of the dollars in the pocket.
Yeah,
I don't think dollars in pocket make much difference.
Well,
People will be
anyway,
getting what they think they deserve and what's next. That's what they're asking. And I really do think these things will change very fast. I agree with Lenore, it's probably not right in front of brain right now, but gee, one more month of polling like the last few and it looks like it's over.
Yes, I think you wrote during the week, it's not so much it's time, but it's over.
That's right, because Kevin Rudd, in my view, isn't actually offering anything. A lot of people are projecting onto him an attitude like on IR or some policies to come, but in the policy cupboard is very, very little, and that is very controversial anyway, like the IR policy. I think it's really tied to Howard, and that's probably why there's slight bit of hope that Costello can actually do a better job.
Final observation or a prediction, Lenore?
I think John Howard's probably going to spend a lot of time emphasising his team and comparing his team with Kevin Rudd's team as a way of getting around all the difficulties that we've been discussing this morning.
George?
The 45 cents an hour that was mentioned a couple of weeks ago about Therese Rain's contracts, I actually counted them up. They roughly come out at about $15 a week, which is roughly what the tax cuts were for average earners.
Talking about the global warming hysteria, right? Every week another thing. The Age presents sea level rise.